But welcome back. It's nice to see you all again. I hope you're all doing well. Yes, before we start, please join me in prayer. Good afternoon, Heavenly Parent and True Parents. We're back once again for joining the dots. I pray, like every other day, that we can be attentive during this time and we can receive a lot of good information and just enjoy this time that we have together, share our thoughts with each other and learn together. And we thank you for that. And I want to offer this now on behalf of everyone here. And my name is Sarah, daughter of the Blessed Central Family, Arju.
So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. It's nice to see so many nice faces here again. So I'll just going to be carrying on from where we left off yesterday. Okay, so good evening, and just a few little thoughts from bits I didn't quite finish yesterday. So you're looking a little bit there at looking at the principal explanation of the nature of reality. So we looked at that film, The Secret of Chaos. And you can see that's the way the world really is. That's what modern science says. We also looked at the basic assumptions that are underlying traditional science, which is materialistic and mechanical and unable to explain the kind of modern science which and things which scientists have been discovering, that actually reality is not the way they thought it was. It's actually very, very different to the way they thought it was. This whole chaotic element to it, as opposed to being something very predictable. But also we saw this order within chaos. And so we can see that actually the principle fits with that kind of understanding of the nature of the world. When I started reading the Divine Principle book years and years ago, I could never really get my head around a lot of these sentences and these paragraphs because I didn't really understand science well enough. I didn't really understand the nature of reality. But when, must be nearly 30 years ago, I started studying a lot about self-generating order and spontaneous order, mostly coming at it from a perspective of social science, then later natural science. I discovered actually that's what the principle is. The principle, I think, is the most accurate description of the nature of reality that I've come across. So the principle philosophy then, unification thought, or whatever you want to call it, actually maps onto the natural world much better than materialism does, much better than Pythagoras does. It maps onto the natural world much better than any of these other philosophies. And so I say, yes, it's the best explanation of the nature of reality because it maps on much better than the other ones do. And then when you actually look at the natural world, there's lots of other things which that film obviously wasn't talking about, but things which I came across many years ago. Things like this, that life that thrives within the Earth's crust. You can drill down several kilometers into the ground to get very close to the Earth through the Earth's crust, and it's incredibly hot down there. But even down there, several kilometers below the surface of the Earth, people have found life. They found bacteria down there, certain kinds of bacteria that live down there, kilometers below the surface of the Earth, and they thrive. Not very well. They grow very, very slowly, but they find them down there. And then the same if you go to the bottom of the ocean, find these things called black smokers, which are by the cracks in the ocean floor, where again there's volcanic hot lava down there, and again there's very, very hot emissions of very, very mineral-rich water down there. And when they looked down there, they found also there's a huge amount of life there. Again, bacteria that are completely different to bacteria on the surface of the Earth, plants, animals, all kinds of sea creatures which have no analog, which are completely different to ones that you find closer to the surface of the ocean. And so, again, even under the Antarctic, etc., etc. So the impression I got was that basically, wherever life can emerge, life will emerge. If it's possible for life to emerge, then it will. And the reason is because everything has its inherent directive nature towards greater and greater levels of complexity. And all these interactions are driven by the universal prime force. So the universal prime force and the inherent directive nature are moving things to combine together with each other in reciprocal relationships, the give and take, move towards greater and greater levels of complexity. And if life can emerge, it will emerge. Yeah, that's the basic impression I've had. If life can emerge, it will emerge. And I thought, well, did God really go around and design this little bacteria to live 5 kilometers under the surface of the earth? I don't think so. I think God created a universe with these dual characteristics of internal and external, positivity and negativity, such that all these levels of complexity would emerge. Very much like this very simple algorithm which scientists use. And so they're always surprised by all the different things that spontaneously emerge from a very, very simple algorithm. So here's a black smoker. It's on the very, very deep in the trenches in the ocean. And you have these cracks, and then always this very, very hot water just coming up here, incredibly mineral rich, and all kinds of funny little creatures form around these stacks. This here is something kind of interesting. It's just an incredibly complex thing which just emerged, developed spontaneously. It's not alive, but it's one of the building blocks of living organisms. And then another thing I wanted to talk about. So, yeah, sometimes people ask me, well, do you think there's life elsewhere in the universe? And to be perfectly honest, I would say if it's possible, if there is a planet where it's possible for life to emerge, I think life will emerge. I think the universe quite possibly is teeming with life. Are there other human beings? I doubt that very much indeed, but who knows? You know, I'm very agnostic about these things. But I think because God constructed the universe in the way that he designed it, then I think it's quite possible that life will emerge wherever it can emerge. So we'll just have to wait and see. Then another part, so just carrying on from where we left off yesterday. So we talked about Nimrod and how he built the Tower of Babel and how they had this incredible vision for a great building project, and how it was that he was able to organize all the people there and inspire them to participate in this utopian project, to build this tower, to protect themselves from another flood perhaps, to be able to attack God, you know, who they thought was a very cruel dictator. And you can see basically he's an archetype of, or prototype of all the dictators in human history. These are just some of the ones from the 20th century. There's Mussolini, who said that he was like a god, and you know he came to power and with this incredible project of creating a different kind of society, using the power of the state to change society, create a different kind of society. We can see here, this is Kim Il-sung, did the same sort of thing, took the power of the state as the head of the Communist Party and used the power of the state to implement a certain kind of vision of a planned socialist society in which everybody's supposed to be equal. This one here, of course, is Joseph Stalin, who also came to power with after the death of Lenin. And again, you develop these incredible building projects and canals. And when you actually look at it, these things were all built using forced labor. And he developed this vast gulag of forced laborers working to build this ideal socialist state. Down here, got Saddam Hussein in Iraq, another socialist. Mengistu, who was a Marxist in Ethiopia, again came to power, became the president there. Adolf Hitler, of course, don't need to say anything more about him, the National Socialist. And Mao Zedong, who's probably the greatest mass murderer in the whole of human history. The number of people who perished and died in the various purges and the Cultural Revolution, all sorts of other things. And so these are the most unspeakable criminals in human history. Yeah, but they all used the power of the state to be able to commit these terrible crimes. But to themselves, they thought they were good people doing good things, trying to build a utopian society. And not only did they think they were good people trying to do good things, but a huge proportion of the population thought the same. You still find many admirers of Stalin in Russia today. Not so many admirers of Hitler in Germany, but there are a few in different places. Mao Zedong's picture still hangs in front of not Red Square, it's Tiananmen Square. Don't know about Mengistu, Saddam Hussein, again, there were some people who liked him. And of course, Kim Il-sung is still the eternal, even though he's died, he's still regarded as the eternal president in the spiritual world, ruling over North Korea. And his grandson is now in charge. So these are all Nimrod kind of figures. And like Nimrod, were worshipped, saw themselves as being like gods. And so basically you can see they're basically what we would call fascists. Obviously Mussolini and Hitler were, but there's not a lot of difference between fascism and communism. The main difference, fascism is national socialism and communism is international socialism. So fascism then denies the fundamental values of modern democracy. So none of these countries was a democracy, proper democracy. If to the extent there might be democracy, it's a one-party state where people can only choose to vote for somebody who belongs to that one single party. Denies the fundamental values of modern democracy, including respect for individual and basic rights, freedoms of speech, the press, and associations. People cannot freely associate with each other without permission and getting registered by the state. Certainly don't have freedom of speech, and least of all, freedom to criticize the government or the state. No freedom of the press, and not a proper parliamentary system where there can be proper debates and discussions. Race or nationality is the ultimate value, to be upheld by the strong nation state. So that's a particular feature of fascism, especially of Nazism, which had a sort of hierarchy of different races, and some races are better than others. So that's one of the distinguishing features between fascism and communism. Communism based upon a particular class. If you belong to the ruling class, the old ruling class, then you were destined for the Gulag. Whereas if you belong to the proletariat, then you're okay. So instead of it being a race-based system, it's a class-based system. Individuals and institutions exist only for the benefit of the state. So again, we have this sense that I talked about before, everything's for the benefit of the state. The state is like God to be worshipped. Under fascism, individuals cannot claim freedom as their inviolable right. They are to sacrifice their freedom in their duty to serve the state. Okay, so again, that's very much like we looked at when we looked at Plato and we looked at Socrates. Serving the state for Socrates is the highest duty he could possibly imagine. I forgot to say this. Oh, actually, yeah, this is from the Divine Principle. This paragraph comes from the Divine Principle book. So the guiding political principle of fascism holds that all power and authority should be entrusted in one supreme leader rather than distributed among people. Yeah, it's like Nimrod. The personal will of the leader dictates the governing ideology for the entire nation. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and the leaders of Japan's militaristic government were dictators of the fascist time. Okay, that was in the middle of the 20th century. We can carry on today. The ruling ideology of China is that of President Xi, is it? I can't how you pronounce it. Anyway, it used to be Mao Zedong. His ideology is one of the ruling ideologies. And now the current president of China says his ideology is the ruling ideology for China, with all its aspirations towards they call themselves the Middle Kingdom or the Central Kingdom, and aspirations to having hegemony over the entire world. Okay, so that's, again, it's all about duty, serving the state. The state then becomes like God. People derive their identity from the state. The state has the authority to make law. The state has the authority to make people join the army, to fight for it, and to sacrifice people for the benefit of the state, all following that tradition of Nimrod. And so under communism, countless millions of people were sacrificed, they were perished, they were driven to their deaths and forced labor. But you also find a similar thing with idealists as well. There's a list of idealists here, again from the 20th century. There's Woodrow Wilson, president of the United States of America during the First World War, also a socialist. He introduced something called the Freedom Act. Under the Freedom Act, he introduced federal income tax, which rose to 77%. Bit ironic, isn't it? Introducing this under the Freedom Act, and lots of other measures as well. There's Clement Attlee in Britain, who introduced the welfare state. During the Second World War in Britain, a lot of people were very impressed by fascism and the power of the state. And so when when the British state and the British people were mobilized to fight against Germany, the politicians, instead of relinquishing that power, which had been mobilized to fight against Germany, decided to use that same power to create a welfare state. This is Kwame Nkrumah. He was president of Ghana before and after independence. And again, a socialist, had incredible vision for a unified Africa, Pan-Africanism, and he was elected, but he decided to make himself president for life. And this is F.D. Roosevelt as well, who also introduced a lot of things, the New Deal. So they're very idealistic. The very men who are the most anxious to plan society are the most dangerous, if they're allowed to do so, and the most intolerant of the plan and most intolerant of the planning of others. From the saintly and single-minded idealist to the fanatic is often a very small step. And that's the case. Sometimes you meet people, they're incredibly saintly, very idealistic, but they're incredibly intolerant of other people being allowed to pursue their ideals and to plan their life in the way they want to. So when the state, led by whichever idealist it is, comes up with some plan to reorganize society, to reorganize the economy, according to the way they think it ought to be, then there are lots of people who disagree. So what do you do with all these people who disagree? Then these people who are very single-minded, idealists, and very saintly become very fanatical, and those people then are arrested, sent to prison, sent to the Gulag. It started off, well, not started. One example also happened after the French Revolution with Robespierre. And so this is someone called Friedrich Hayek. I often quote him. I'll talk about him more later. He was very close to father during the 1980s. It is indeed probable that more harm and misery have been caused by men determined to use coercion to stamp out a moral evil than by men intent on doing evil. So if you're intent on doing evil, you may become a serial murderer, but you may end up killing, maybe, if you're lucky, inverted commas, 100 people in your life. Whereas if you become the head of a country and you want to do incredible good, you can actually cause the death of countless millions of people in the pursuit of some moral, get rid of moral evil. You end up causing a huge amount of harm and damage to others. This is Albert Camus. He was a French, interesting person. Sorry, I haven't got his name down there. So he was alive during the Second World War, and that experience he had under Nazi occupation made him reflect a lot about things. He said the welfare of the people, in particular, has always been the alibi of tyrants, and it provides a further advantage of giving servants of tyranny a good conscience. So people think they're doing good, so they can commit all kinds of terrible, evil crimes with a clear conscience. So think about, all those people that were, guards and running the death camps like Auschwitz. They all got up in the morning, had breakfast with their family, they kissed their wife and their kids goodbye. They went off to murder a few hundred or a few thousand people, came home, hugged their wife and read their children a nice story and listened to a bit of Beethoven in the evening. How could they do that? They did it with a clear conscience because they believed that the people that they were murdering and exterminating were subhuman. That's the nature of a particular ideology. It can subvert people's conscience in that way. So Camus goes on and talks about this a bit more. He says, one might think that a period in which, in the space of 50 years, that was in the middle of the part of the 20th century, uproots, enslaves, or kills 70 million human beings should be condemned out of hand. Generally speaking, it's not, because people don't even know about it today. But its culpability must still be understood. We need to understand fascism. We need to understand communism. If we don't understand the roots and how it got to be the way it was, you end up repeating it. In more ingenuous times, when the tyrant raised cities for his own greater glory, like Genghis Khan or somebody, when the slave chained to the conqueror's chariot was dragged through the rejoicing streets, that's happened in Rome all the time, when enemies were thrown to the wild beasts in front of the assembled people, again the Colosseum, The mind did not reel before such unabashed crimes, and the judgment remained unclouded. But slave camps under the flag of freedom, think about Auschwitz, work will make you free. Massacres justified by philanthropy. Again, you look at what happened in Cambodia. It's horrendous. Or by a taste for the superhuman. People think they're God. In one sense, crippled judgment. On the day when crime dons the apparel of innocence, through a curious transposition peculiar to our times, it is innocence that is called to justify itself. And you can see a lot of that going on at the moment today. A lot of people doing terrible things with a clear conscience. Appear to be innocent and nice people. Yeah. So what is the principal approach to this, which I was going to look at yesterday, but I just added a few slides there. Okay, so how can we use the principle to analyze what's going on here? So one paragraph in the Divine Principles talks about dual purposes. It says the purpose of the whole is a purpose directed towards the preservation and development of the whole. Individual purpose is a purpose directed towards the preservation, strengthening, and development of the self. So let's try and think about this. This is just one sentence. Or paragraph, how can we unpack that? So if you think about a company, a business, so the purpose for the whole for the business is to preserve the business and to develop the business and to increase its profit. So you run the business effectively and efficiently. You try and produce something that people want, which is a good quality and a reasonable price, and you're concerned about making a profit, either because it's your business or for the shareholders. But at the end of the day, if a business isn't profitable, it goes out of business, it goes bankrupt. So the purpose of the whole is destroyed. So that's one aspect. The purpose of the whole is that. The individual purpose directed towards preservation, strengthening, development of the self. So supposing you're working for this company, what are you concerned about? Well, preservation of yourself. In other words, you want to earn money, so you can go home, you can feed yourself and your family, you can pay the rent or pay the mortgage, so you can preserve yourself. Yeah, self-preservation. And at the same time, you want to strengthen that. So also your purpose is not just getting money. You also want thinking, okay, how can I develop myself? How can I develop my career? How can I get promoted within this company? How can I learn more? How can I study more? How can I get more qualifications so I can develop myself and I can fulfill my potential? Yeah. So there's the purpose of the whole and there's the purpose of the individual. Okay, so man's individual purpose is to preserve and maintain his existence. So you want to make sure you're safe. If you're working for a company which has really poor health and safety, you start getting worried and you think, I better not operate this machine, I might lose my hand. So what do? You try and find a job in another company. You try to move to a place where you can it's safer. Yeah, safety is really important. So you want to maintain your existence. On the other hand, he has a whole-orientated purpose of life to make certain contribution to his family, society, and nation, the member of these bodies. So it's not enough just to, okay, I've got food to eat, I've water, I've got a shelter, I feel safe, I can walk out into the street without being afraid of getting mugged. I've got but that's not enough. Okay, I want to have relationships. I don't want to live in lockdown and self-isolation for the whole of my life. I want love and experience love, so get married, I want to have a family, I have children, I want to go to work for my children so my children can have a better future than the one that I had. And then, okay, that's not enough. I want to get involved in society, maybe involved in charity work or help the neighbors. I might want to get involved in setting up a chess club or all sorts of things. Boy Scouts, a whole range of things. And you might think, okay, I want to get involved in local politics. I might even want to get involved in national politics, etc., etc. So our individual purpose is not just to preserve our existence, we also have a whole-orientated mentality, purpose of life. This is inbuilt, inherent directive nature that we have. Our mind is wanting to always expand these and find a way in which you can live a meaningful life, getting involved in a wider society. So the individual purpose and the purpose of the whole are not independent, but rather related and interdependent. That's really important. So you can only fulfill your individual purpose if you can in the wider sphere of things. They're related, interdependent. This is really important, this last bit. The purpose for the whole is also secondarily a purpose for the betterment of the individual. The individual purpose is not separate from the purpose of the whole. The purpose of the whole cannot continue to exist without guaranteeing the individual purpose. Okay, so if you're working for a company and the company is doing really well, then also you should also be doing really well. Yeah, it makes sense. These two should be connected. Now, supposing you're working for a company and all they're concerned about is the bottom line. All they're concerned about is exploiting the people who are working for them, trying to get as much work out of them for as little pay, and with paying them as little as possible. And you have a boss who just goes around ordering you about. So here you feel, okay, it's not ideal, yeah? And so a company which is run like that, which is really badly managed, what happens is the most capable, intelligent, creative people working in that company feel there's no future here. I'm wasting my time. I'm going to leave this company and go and get a job in a better company. And so what happens then, if in a company people cannot fulfill their individual purpose, then what happens is the people go and get a job somewhere else. So eventually the purpose of the whole cannot be fulfilled and the business goes out of business. So that's the way it should work, and generally speaking, the way it does work. On the other hand, if everybody, all the individuals just want to get as much as they can out of the company and just go on strike so they can get more pay, then eventually they will find the company cannot function anymore because it's no longer profitable, and the company then will go out of business, and so they will no longer have a job. So they can't fulfill their individual purpose anymore either. So you can see there the individual purpose, the purpose of the whole are related and interdependent. And you can only fulfill one if the other's also been fulfilled adequately and properly. And again, if you're working in a company which takes care of the people who are working for that company as employees, then the employees have a sense of loyalty. And there may be some kind of economic difficulty that's happening because of the wider economy. The company may go through some struggles, but out of a sense of loyalty to the company, people will carry on working and even take a pay cut for a certain period of time. Yeah, because they feel this company cares for me and my well-being, so I'm going to give something back. So it's that kind of interdependent relationship, and that's really important. So this is really important. So when you get fascism and communism, what you have is a purpose of the whole. It's not respecting the purpose of the individual. So in those kind of systems, fascism, communism, these kind of systems, what happens, the individual purpose is being sacrificed for the sake of the purpose of the whole. People are actually told, you should sacrifice yourself for the state, or the state is going to sacrifice you for its own purposes. That's not the principle, because there it means that the individual purpose is being destroyed or sacrificed for the purpose of the whole. And that's really unprincipled. So where you have the purpose of the individual being dominant and nobody really cares about the purpose of the whole, that's this kind of state in Noah's time, yeah? Social anarchy, failed state kind of thing, where there's just a lot of violence, so people just are out for themselves or out for their family or out for their organized criminal network or whatever it is. Whereas with communism, I said, fascism is the emphasis upon the purpose of the whole. You have to serve the state, and the state can use you in whatever way it wants. So a principal vision then is like this, where the purpose of the whole and the purpose of the individual both need to be fulfilled. They're both related, they're both interdependent. And actually, if you go and read management books about how to manage good companies, you'll find all successful companies, they pretty much function like this. That's just a reality. You go and look at the most successful companies and basically you'll see, yeah, that's the way they work. The people who work there are creative, they feel they can develop their potential there, they feel they're respected, they feel they're well paid or paid fairly, they're treated fairly, so they feel they enjoy working there. And then because they enjoy working there, people generally work harder when they're enjoying what they're doing. And so the company does better, they serve the customers better, produce better quality goods, and so they're profitable. But companies which are not based upon these principles, they become unsuccessful and they go out of business. Okay, so that makes sense. So this is like a sort of how you'd apply the principle to analyze these two different things these two different stories we were talking about here: Noah's time and the Tower of Babel. Yeah, these are the two poles through which political philosophy revolves. Either goes too far one way, extreme individualism, or too far the other way, extreme collectivism. And yeah, so as I said, yeah, this is again Hayek. I'll talk about him later. In theory, socialism may wish to enhance freedom, but in practice, every kind of collectivism, that's where the purpose of the whole is overwhelming, yeah, must produce the characteristic features of fascism, Nazism, communism have in common. Totalitarianism is nothing but consistent collectivism. So consistent collectivism was where the whole sacrifices the individual. There's no freedom of speech, no freedom of thought, no freedom of movement, no freedom of association, no freedom of religion. Don't even have the freedom to own your own house, to own your own business, to buy and sell whatever you want to buy and sell. This freedom is basically at the very minimum. And so what kind of people did God like? Well, when we look at the kind of characters in the Bible that God likes or seems to like, God loves those who resist the power of the collective and who are willing to speak truth to power. So we saw this in Abraham. We looked at the story of Abraham and his confrontation with Nimrod, who was building this totalitarian state. We saw that Abraham confronted Nimrod and spoke truth to power. As a result, he was thrown into the fiery furnace, but fortunately the angel stepped in and he wasn't burned to death. And so he decided to become a refugee and he left later on he left Haran and he became a wanderer. He became a shepherd. He was a rich man. But he was a shepherd. So being a shepherd then meant he didn't have to follow anybody else's instructions. He had no boss. All he did, as I said before, God said to him, walk before me, be blameless. So he's just living according to his conscience. So in that sense, he had complete freedom. Yeah, just freely just following his conscience. And then we saw that with Moses as well. So Moses, even though he's brought up in a palace where you'd expect that he would worship power, worship authority, at the end of the day, he repudiated the authority of the state, and if it was against his conscience. And we see this in several people in Moses' life. There was Pur and Shua, the two midwives who refused to obey the Pharaoh and murder all the Hebrew boys when they were born. They followed their conscience, rejected the authority of the state. We saw Pharaoh's daughter, Bitya. She saved Moses' life and brought him up as his own son, again rejecting the authority and disobeying her father and breaking the law. We saw when Moses killed an Egyptian, because I haven't actually talked about that story. It's not as it looks. But anyway, he killed an Egyptian. And then when the Egyptian authorities wanted to have him arrested and tried, instead of doing the Socrates thing and saying, yes, I'm going to be tried by the state and I'm going to allow the state to put me to death, he actually packed his bags and he fled into the wilderness, where he became a shepherd. And again, he developed his own relationship with God through his conscience. And after 40 years, he had this encounter with God at the burning bush. And then when they took them out of Egypt, then they all had, during the Passover, all the Hebrews were supposed to kill a lamb and put the lamb's blood on the doorpost. Killing the lamb was an act of extreme disrespect because they were killing the lamb, which is one of the gods of the Egyptians. Again, showing their repudiation of the authority of these false gods. So that's interesting. Those are the kind of people that are attracted to God, the kind of people that God loves, who speak truth to power. So I want to move on now to covenantal political economy. So we saw these two stories in the Bible. One of the time of Noah, of social disorder, them against us. And we saw the time of Babel, you make them into us. It's totalitarian, it's an empire. So what was the biblical political philosophy? So what God is trying to do, he's trying through this whole process of restoration, trying ultimately to establish what we would call the kingdom of heaven or Chungogok. So what are the principles of biblical political economy which God is revealing? How to resolve this problem of these two different purposes. So it's called covenantal economy, covenantal political economy. You might wonder, what's a covenant then? It's a bit like a contract, except unlike a contract which finishes after a certain number of years or a certain amount of time, a covenant is eternal, it's everlasting. So a covenant is made when two or more people pledge themselves in loyalty to one another to achieve together what neither of them can achieve alone. A covenant is not solely about me, it's about a me and a you who become an us together. It creates a new identity. So the classical idea of a covenant is, or model of a covenant, is marriage. Marriage is a covenant, which is why the prophets always compare the covenant between God and the people of Israel to a marriage. So when two people get married, they both walk into the church as two individuals. They make various vows and promises to each other. Prayers are said, rings are exchanged, and when they leave the church, they're no longer two individuals, they're now a couple. Yeah. So there's been an ontological change. They've now become an us. We're doing it together. And that's one of my wife's favorite words. Why don't we do it together? Yeah. And that's the way it is. So that's this vision of covenant. And it's not saying, oh, I'm going to sign a contract with you, we'll be married for the next 3 years. The idea of a covenant is you're making vows to each other till death us do part. So the vision is of an eternal, permanent relationship. So that's marriage, a covenant. Okay, so let's have a look at the covenants in the Bible then. So as you might know, that after the flood, then God made a promise to Noah, and he said to Noah, I'm going to make a covenant with you and all your descendants, and there won't be another flood. Part of the covenant will be there won't be another flood. And so the sign of the covenant that God made with Noah is a rainbow. And so that's why you see all these rainbows all over the place these days. So this covenant then also had a content, certain universal laws. There are 7 universal laws that are part of this covenant. This is a covenant given to all humanity, because all human beings, according to the Bible, are descended from Noah's family. So the first commandment was, you shall not worship a false deity. So you shall not worship idols. You shouldn't be an idol worshipper. And of course, a human being is an idol, like Nimrod. The state is an idol. It's a false deity. People think that's the source of their identity and the source of law. Another one is, do not blaspheme God. Yeah. Be very careful how you use language about God. Do not murder or injure. Do not have forbidden sexual relations. Do not steal. Do not eat a live animal. You might think, what's that about? Well, that's right from the very beginning, the idea of animal rights. You have to treat animals with respect. So who would eat a live animal? Well, the way it worked in the olden days, they didn't have fridges and freezers. So if you want to keep if you want animal meat to be fresh, then obviously the animal has to be alive. So if you want to have a bit of, a leg of lamb, you don't necessarily want to kill the whole lamb so you can have one leg and the other 3/4 of it will just decay and go moldy. So what they might do is they might tie a piece of string around the leg and cut off the blood supply, and then just cut off one leg so the lamb would wander around on the other 3 legs, keeping the rest of the lamb fresh, keeping the meat fresh. Sounds very cruel, and it is. So that's one of the laws. You shall not eat of a live animal. You have to treat animals with respect, animal rights. So all these people prattling on about animal rights today should go and read the Bible. It's old stuff, old laws they don't know about. And then finally, establish laws and courts to ensure justice. So these are universal laws which apply to all humanity. It's very, very simple. It's not about everybody should believe the same thing, not about everybody should live the same way, not about everybody should have the same values. There's 7 very simple laws which create a framework for people to pursue their own values, to pursue their own visions, to pursue their own dreams, etc., to plan their own lives. And so the idea here then is every nation then would have its own laws, its own traditions, its own currency, its own way of doing things, its own political structures, but within these 7 universal laws. And then there's the other covenant, is the covenant God made with the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. This is called the Mosaic covenant. And here these are particular laws. So the Mosaic laws are 613 laws. Okay, so these are the laws which only apply to the Hebrews, the people of Israel. They don't apply to all the other people. Everybody else, all the other nations, can develop their own law codes about what kind of food to eat and this, that, and the other. Yeah, so these are laws that apply to the people of Israel at there. So this is the idea that there isn't supposed to be one single code of law that everybody's supposed to follow. It's a kind of unity because there's universal laws that everybody observes, but also respecting diversity. Yeah, this is the idea of unity in diversity. Oh, I got it at the top there. Okay, so that's the kind of unity. So they were going on a journey then from Egypt into Canaan. And what was that journey all about? Well, what was going on here was a spiritual, this is the people of Israel led out of Egypt by Moses. When they were in Egypt, they were slaves, and Moses is leading them out of Egypt into the promised land of Canaan. But in order to do that, they had to go through a spiritual, relational, social, political, and economic transformation. What God wanted to do was establish a different kind of society in Canaan. He didn't want the Hebrews to go there, leave slavery in Egypt, and go to Canaan and replicate a slave society in Canaan. So in order to go through to do that, they had to go through a huge spiritual change. In other words, they had to develop their relationship with God. They had to go through a relational change. We needed to treat each other differently. So instead of master-slave kind of relationships and that kind of relationships, which would have predominated and become common because of the way they were in a slave society, those relationships needed to change. The social relationships, the political relationships, and the economic. Everything needed to be transformed. And God thought it could happen in 21 days. But God's totally unrealistic. They tried it in 21 months, but then it didn't work out because 2 spies thought it's okay and 10 didn't. So then it took them 40 years. And during that period of 40 years, God said, all the people, the first generation, will die in the wilderness. Only the people, the second generation, will be able to go into Canaan. In other words, not the people who are born in slavery, had a slave mentality, a dependency mentality, yeah, but people who grew up in freedom, living according to their conscience, living according to the law. So that was it's very hard, to go from, when you get institutionalized, it's very hard to live in a free society once one becomes institutionalized, whether it's in prison, the army, or wherever it is. So they're moving here from slavery to freedom, which requires a huge psychological transformation and change. They're moving from a state of being obedient, just doing as they were told. Yeah, we looked at obedience a few days ago. From being obedient to taking the initiative and taking responsibility, not waiting to be told what to do, but recognizing there's an issue here, I'm going to get involved, be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Going from that kind of attitude to one of taking responsibility. And it's only responsible people who are fit to live in a free society. There's no freedom without responsibility and no responsibility without freedom. So in this kind of world they were going to create, God was going to be their king. The greatest thing about God is you can't see him. God is invisible. So that means nobody can be closer to God than anybody else, geographically or in space, because everybody is capable of forming their own personal, profound, and very deep relationship with God. So it means God can rule and guide every single person, every individual. You don't have to go and get on the train, and go to London and Buckingham Palace to go and see the king or the queen. God is there guiding people through their conscience. Yeah, so they had to go through a spiritual transformation of acknowledging God as their king and living a life of conscience. And then also living within the rule of law. So these laws then, they create a space. I'll look at law later on for them to be free. And also creating God-centered families as a basis for their society in Canaan. So we'll look at that again later. So it required a new way of thinking, a new way of feeling, a new way of relating, new culture, new structures. So what needed to change then was the things that were running around in their heads. So I talked about that Monday last week, about stories. Yeah, there's a story which creates the way we think about ourselves, how we see ourselves. And so what needs to change? People need to change their story, their way of thinking, their sense of identity, Along with that, when you change the way you think, it changes the way you feel, changes the way you see other people and you relate to other people. It creates a different kind of culture, and along with this come different structures. As Father said, sometimes people think it's just by superior organization you can create the ideal, but actually it has to start with individual change. With people change the way they think, change the way they feel, change the way they relate to each other, to create a different kind of culture, different political structures, which will come way down the line. Sometimes people, we just need to change the structures. But actually, no, the structures are the things you change last, when everybody comes to some settled agreement about it. So they met God at Mount Sinai, and this is God gave them a vision statement. So again, this is all political philosophy and economy. This is what you should say to Jacob's household and declare to the Israelites. So it's very interesting here. God says to Moses, this is what you should say to Jacob's household and declare to the Israelites. So when it says Jacob's household, what that means isn't just the leaders. It doesn't mean just the men. It means the household, which means all the men and the women and all the children are going to be involved in this decision-making process. Really important. It's incredibly democratic. The whole community is involved. And this is what God says. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, 10 plagues, etc. How I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So it's all part of a journey into a relationship with God and the heart of God. Now, therefore, if you will indeed hearken or listen to my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So this is the vision statement. God says, the whole earth is mine. God owns the world. God owns all the land. God owns all the people. They all belong to him. Yeah. So he wants to separate out the Jewish people, the Hebrews, to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So how does that work? First of all, it's a kingdom of priests. Well, if you look in a village or a town, not everybody's priests. You usually have one priest to, well, I guess nowadays every few thousand people, you might have a vicar or a minister. But anyway, so he wants them all to be priests. Okay, so what does that mean? To whom are they going to be priests? Here's the vision that they'll be the priests to the whole of humanity and a holy sacred nation. And so that's the vision statement. They're going to be the people chosen to bring knowledge of God and God's love and moral laws to the rest of humanity. That's their calling. Not a calling to be the master race. It's not a calling to be the people to rule the world. It's a calling to be priests, to serve the world through teaching people, through their example, about God and about the moral life. In that sense, being a holy nation. But it's got this word if here. So what does that mean? That means that God gave them a choice. They could either accept this calling or say, no, thank you very much. So here is the idea of government by consent. It's up to them whether they accept this calling from God or not. It's up to them whether they do that, government by consent. Okay, it's now 10 to 8, so or 7, depends where you are, I suppose. So I'm going to stop here and we'll have a 15-minute break and I'm going to go and have my dinner. So I hope you all have either a nice coffee or a nice dinner or a nice discussion. So,
well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your discussion or your dinner and you're ready for the next half. Very excited. Over to you, Uncle William.
So this is where we got to. This vision statement, where, as I said, God was inviting them to make a covenant with him. God was inviting them, in that sense, to marry him, to form that kind of relationship. And because it's a covenant, like a marriage, it's an incredibly intense relationship. There's a lot of arguing going on, a lot of fighting, but at the end of the day, it's an eternal covenant. No matter what either side does, they stick together. And so Moses then, he went up and got the 10 commandments and all the other commandments, and he came down and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words, these 613 commandments that the Lord had commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm coming to you in a thick cloud, The people may hear when I speak with you and may also believe you forever. So again, they said, we will do it. Yeah, so that's their commitment, that's their response. They have the ability to respond, and that was their response. And so this is the ceremony for making the covenant. So Moses rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel representing them. And he sent young men to sacrifice oxen to the Lord. And so when they sacrificed an oxen, they would take a very sharp, well, it wasn't a stainless steel knife in those days, I guess a very sharp flint, and they would cut this artery or vein there, and the blood would come out very quickly, and very quickly the oxen would lose consciousness. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar. So the altar then represented God. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will understand. Interesting. All the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will understand. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So you might wonder, what's going on here? It looks very icky. Who wants to have blood sprinkled all over themselves? Why not water? So what's going on here? It's called the change of blood lineage. What God is doing, what Moses is doing here is saying half the blood is on the altar, represents God, and the other half of the blood he sprinkles all over the people. So they all got sprinkled with blood. And so what that means, that they're literally, not literally, metaphorically, they're becoming the people of God. They're metaphorically becoming God's sons and daughters, because the same blood that runs in God runs through them. They're becoming the sons and daughters of God through the ceremony. So God is now their king. God is now their heavenly parent, because they have the same, connected to the same blood. And it's not water, because as we know, blood is thicker than water. A relationship based upon blood, you can't break that. It's eternal. Relationships based upon water, yeah, it's a different kind of depth to it. So that's the symbolism of this, what's going on here. They're committing themselves in that way. And so you see a similar kind of thing. This is basically the basis of the American Constitution as well. When the Pilgrim Fathers are traveling from England to America, 1620 on the Mayflower, then they decided, well, how are we going to work together? What kind of government are we going to have? So they made a covenant with each other. And so the basis of American political economy is also the covenant. And so that's why very often when presidents are inaugurated, they give a long speech about recounting the history and recounting this covenant. They talk about it, we the people, this kind of idea, we the people. And one of the things that's interesting there, they said, we will do and we will understand. So this is Jonathan Sacks' explanation of this. We can only understand one's faith by doing it, by performing the commands and living a spiritual life. In the beginning is the deed. Only then comes the grasp, the insight, the comprehension. This is a signal and substantive point. The modern Western mind tends to put things in opposite order. We seek to understand what we're committing ourselves to before making the commitment. That's fine when what is at stake is signing a contract or buying a new mobile phone or purchasing a subscription, but not when making a deep existential commitment. So that's why the marriage is the metaphor. You don't understand the person who you're marrying before you get married to them. Even after you've been living with them for 50 or 60 years, they're still a mystery. You still can't understand them. But it's through making this commitment then that you actually start to learn. So that's this idea. Once you start doing something, then you start reflecting upon what you're doing, and then you begin to understand what you're doing. Yeah. So first, it's like learning to play a musical instrument or learning how to do anything. First, you start doing it, then you reflect upon the result that you're getting, and after a while, you begin to understand it, and some kind of theoretical basis for it develops. But you can't, just the same with driving a car. You can't learn to drive a car by memorizing the driving manual. You actually have to start driving, and you make mistakes, hopefully not too bad mistakes. And as you're driving and practicing, you're reflecting upon what it is that you're doing, and then you're learning how to drive a car. Then you're understanding what you should do. That's an important principle here. But the other thing is, it says we will do and we will understand. So they're all doing the same thing. They're all keeping the same commandments, but each of them will understand it differently. So it means each of them is pursuing and following their own spiritual path. They're not united together by a common ideology or religion, or they're united together just by following the laws, by observing the laws, and then by understanding the meaning of those laws differently in their own personal life. So each of them is developing their own spiritual life and their own spiritual path. There's a lot of freedom there. Yeah. So what is the significance of this event then? So first of all, as I said, first of all, it's spoken to all the people. It wasn't an agreement between God and Moses. So Moses isn't the founder of Judaism in the way that Buddha is the founder of Buddhism, or Jesus and Paul of Christianity, or Muhammad of Islam, essentially. Actually, all the people had this encounter and common experience with God. All 600,000 of them encountered God at Mount Sinai. So not one founder, it's a common experience. And all the people entered into this covenant, the men, the women, and the children. So this then is the beginning of not just the spiritual community of the Israelites, it's also the beginning of their political community. And so when we read people like Milton, Hobbes, Locke, I've mentioned some of these in the past, then they all knew the Bible inside out. And so when they talked about what they were developing their own political philosophy, it was based upon what they understood as the beginning of the political community of the people of Israel. So here, God was a lawgiver because of this covenant, but also this means that there's limits to the exercise of power. Because God is a lawgiver, it means that human beings are constrained and limited by God's law. Nobody's entitled to break the law because it's God's law. Doesn't matter if you're the king or whoever you are, that law applies in the same way to you as it does to everybody else. It also limits the, lawmaking ability of human beings. Also, there's the idea here, there's no legitimate government without consent. God entered into this covenant by consent. That means only no government which hasn't got consent of the people is not a legitimate government. That's one of the roots of democracy. And I said all the women, everybody is involved in this decision making, the women and the children. And so we can think about it in this way. Two very, very different visions of the way the politics and political economy and society should be. Here we got the pyramid of Egypt, and also pyramids of other pyramids I showed you, feudalism and Plato's state. Yeah, and here we have the symbol of the Jewish people. Yeah, so what's the difference? The architectural symbols of the world's first empires are monumental statements in stone of a hierarchical society, broad at the base, ordinary people down there, and narrow at the top. So up here sits the pharaoh and the ruling class. The Mesopotamian ziggurats, that's where Abraham grew up, and the Egyptian pyramids. For both, the people are there to support the leader. The great Jewish symbol, the menorah, inverts a triangle. It is broad at the top and narrow at the base. The leader's there to support the people. A very different conception of a leader being a servant. And that was Moses' conception, what he modeled himself as servant leadership. He was there to serve God and to serve the people. They weren't there to serve him or support him. A very different kind of conception. Okay, so we're moving on now. As I said, they wanted to establish an ideal, well, not an ideal society, want to establish a peaceful, a good civil society in Canaan. And so they needed to have laws. So let's have a look at some of the content of these laws, which are there to create a good society. So first of all, there's a preamble to the covenant. So God says, I'm the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. So God is the one who's initiating this treaty or initiating this covenant. And so the first thing he does is he has a historical review of the relationship he has with the people. Yeah, I'm brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That's who I am. So that becomes a sort of sense of obligation to each other. He cares about them, so there's some sense that they have something reciprocal to go back. So also here you have the idea of morality flows out of identity. So it says here, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. That is establishing I am the Lord your God. It's the relationship, a personal relationship between God and the people. Yeah. And if you understand who you are, then you actually understand how you should live. So God didn't say, I'm the creator of the universe. He said, I'm the one who brought you out of Egypt. Just like when God met Moses at Mount Sinai, he didn't say to Moses, I am the God who created the universe. He said to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that was God's calling card. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm a personal God. I know your ancestors personally. I had a personal relationship with them. And then God goes on to say, I'm concerned about the suffering of my people. So God reveals himself as a God, first of all, of heart, who cares and hates to see people suffering, hates violence. Anyway, so there's a little historical review of this relationship. And as I said, morality flows out of identity. So if you know who you are, you'll know how you should live. So I remember just something I read in a magazine some while ago now, I guess. Anyway, there's somebody who lives in England called Prince William. He's the grandson of the Queen. And when he gave his first interview, when I think he turned about 21 years old, then the journalist said to him, when did you realize that one day you'll become the King of England? And he said, well, when I was a little boy, he said, I used to go and visit my granny. And I noticed that my granny lived in a bigger house than anybody else. That my granny actually had lived in a palace, Buckingham Palace, and she also had castles. And I thought, wow, my granny is amazing. She lives in a palace, so rich. And then he said, I realized from time to time I saw Granny putting on a crown. And it wasn't a paper crown like the kind you wear at Christmas. It was a real crown with diamonds and gold, and it was really heavy. Then I realized, wow, my granny is a queen, not just an ordinary queen. She's a real queen. That's so cool. My granny's the Queen of England. Anyway, so that went on for a while, he said, until one day he sort of noticed that Granny had a few, getting more and more wrinkles all the time. And it occurred to him that, well, maybe, God forbid, maybe Granny will die one day. God forbid. Worst thing that can happen. And then, well, what will happen next? Who will wear the crown then? So they figured it out. Well, Granny's got 4 kids. There's Dad, and there's Uncle Andrew, and there's Auntie Anne, and there's Uncle Edward, and wonder which one will become the next person with the crown. And you figure, well, my dad's the oldest, so because my dad is the oldest, then my dad will become the next king. Wow, that's amazing. My dad is a future king of England. He felt so good. They figured, well, one day Dad will probably die. I wonder who'll become the king after that. So he figured it out. Well, there's only Harry and me, and I'm older than Harry, so obviously it's going to be me. And then he said, suddenly, every single door closed. All the possibilities and potential things he could do with his life, all the doors slammed shut. Suddenly he realized, I can't think about becoming a journalist or an engineer or farmer or going and living in another country. Suddenly there's only one door left to walk through. He realized, I am going to be, God willing, the future King of England. So when he understood who he was, he said, I understood how I should live my life. The rest of my life then is to prepare myself to one day sit upon the throne. So obviously he had to go into the armed forces, as is a tradition, and get involved in public work and public service and all these things. He realized, so it's really important. When you know who you are, then you know how you should live. Morality flows out of identity. When you recognize I'm the son or daughter of God, then it becomes very clear how you should live your life, what kind of person you should be. So people have identity who don't know what they should do with their life. It's because they don't know who they are. So the most fundamental identity is a relationship with the divine. I am the Lord your God. Yeah. So that's the most fundamental relationship. And so then it goes into the 10 commandments or 10 words. You shall have no other gods before me. So what does that mean? So it's all about getting the right order, getting priorities right, putting God first. It's about, you love your country. Patriotism is a great virtue. Love your country, care about your country. But nationalism isn't when you think your country is perfect and better than all the other countries. It's only natural to love your country because it's your country, it's your home. But then if you really love your country, you recognize, yeah, there's good things, there's bad things, and I want to try and improve it. So also it should be about worshiping more deeply and let God challenge every aspect of your life. And fundamentally, it's about the primacy of conscience. As Father said, your conscience is more important than a parent, teacher, and king. So you can love and respect your parents, who are like a god when you're a child. You can love and respect your teacher, who are also sometimes like gods. You can love and respect your king or monarch, who also sometimes appears like a god. But you shall have no other gods before me. So conscience is more important than parent, teacher, or king. So if your parent, teacher, or king tells you to do something which is wrong, then you follow your conscience, even at the risk of your life. And that was the tradition of Abraham. Absolutely listen to his conscience. So we talk about in the pledge of absolute obedience. What we're talking about there is not absolutely obeying a human being, because that's unprincipled, it's non-biblical. It's about absolutely obeying and listening to your conscience. So the second commandment, you shall not make a graven image. So that's like making a painting or a picture of God or a statue of God. And the reason is because God is invisible. That's one of the great things about God. God is invisible. And God has been invisible. God is infinite. God is eternal. No beginning and no end. God is an absolute being. God is ultimately mysterious. You can never get to the bottom of God. You can never understand everything there is to understand about God, and which we're limited hugely by our language. Yeah, because of our language. That's, we can only conceptualize God in terms of the language and vocabulary we have. God is transcendent, God is awesome, God is living, and God is dynamic. Yeah, God is becoming, not being static. Whereas all images of God are finite. They're all limited. They're also relative. It's like, this is what I think God is like. They're all temporal, they're in time, they're all static because they're fixed, and they're all lifeless. So when people argue about God, they're arguing about my concept of God is right and your concept of God is wrong. So all you can say at the end of the day, everybody's concept of God is wrong. Everybody's concepts of God are false because they're all relative. They're all limited by language, but also they're relative. Everybody is like, as a human being, myself, my wife sees me as her husband, my kids sees me as their dad, my granddaughter sees me as grandpa. When I was teaching in school, they called me sir, and sometimes less polite things than that. And then whenever I saw my mum, she treated me like I was still 5 years old. And that's just the way it goes. All these perspectives are all relative. None is the absolute one. None is absolutely correct. And so idolatry is when you make your absolute perspective, idolatry is making your relative perspective and claiming it's absolute. Yeah, you have your own concept of God, and you think it's the absolute correct one, but it's only relative, and it can never be anything other than relative. It can never be anything other than your personal understanding of the way God is. It can never be absolute. It can never be perfect. It can never be complete. It can only ever be partial. Yeah. So it's not just about making pictures or statues of God. It's also recognizing the limitations of our own concepts of God, which of course is limited very much by our own vocabulary, which again I talked about last week. Yeah. And so what people are often doing then, when they're making their image of God, they're making, they're worshipping themselves, making the relative absolute. I find it very interesting, listen to what people say Jesus is like. Because it's nothing to do, people have their own concept or idea of what Jesus is like. But actually it's got very little to do with what is actually written in the New Testament about him. It's really interesting. People have an idealized view of what Jesus is like, but it doesn't correspond to the Jesus we encounter and read in the New Testament. Yeah. It's very interesting. So what people are doing, basically, they're worshipping themselves. And so basically, we shouldn't have any expectations or preconceptions. It's like sometimes people have expectations or preconceptions about what a particular person is like, based upon their nationality, their race, their color, their religion. You have a certain kind of expectation because they have this label around them, then you expect them to be like that. But we don't like to be treated like that ourselves. We don't want to feel we have to conform to somebody else's expectations or assumptions about what we're like. And it's often like that. So, you can see that. Sometimes people have their expectations of what their spouse should be like. We have a sort of idealized conception of a spouse based upon our own mum or dad, possibly. And we expect our husband or wife to behave in the same way. Yeah. So basically, again, it's the same sort of thing. In that sense, it's a form of idealism. There's also a form of idolatry. People have a sort of idea, okay, I'll only follow a perfect ideal leader. In other words, I'll only follow you and I'll only listen to you if you conform to my expectations of what a leader should be like. In other words, you have to conform to my expectations if I'm going to love you and care about you. Yeah. And often people do that. They try to make somebody else fit their expectations of what they think they ought to be like. And so that often happens when people get married. They're in love with this person, they get married to them, and after a few months or years, they say, you've changed. Actually, the person hasn't changed. People don't change. What has changed is that person no longer conforms to your expectations of what you think they are like, that you've imposed upon them. So in that sense, it's very, very self-centered. You're expecting other people to conform to your idea of how they ought to be. And idealism is like that as well. Idealists, they expect the world to conform to their expectations of how the world ought to be. Instead of recognizing actually lots of people got different ideals and I need to live within my own framework of law, people think, oh, everybody should live in this way. People have an idea based upon equality or justice or this or that or the other, some idea of how society ought to be. And they try to impose that ideal upon the whole of society. So what they're doing, they're trying to change the world to conform to their expectations of how they think the world ought to be. And what happens when they meet people who refuse to go along with that? Well, historically, you lock them up, or you shoot them, or you send them off to the gulag to be involved in forced labor, building the ideal society that you want them to be building. So idealism, that I regard as very self-centered form of idolatry. Instead, we should love people as they are, as opposed to only loving them if they conform to our expectations of how they ought to be. Okay, third commandment, not getting very far here. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain. And this is number 3. And people think, well, what's that mean, taking the Lord's name in vain? Sometimes people think it means, oh, you shouldn't say, oh, God, or oh, Jesus, something bad happened, oh, God. Actually, that's nothing to do with it whatsoever. When people say, oh, God, or oh, Jesus, it's just like it's like a folk memory. Because in the past, when something went wrong, people would say, oh, Jesus, oh, God, give me strength in this situation. Yeah. That's what people will be saying. Oh, God, help me. God, give me strength to deal with this reality, the situation I just found myself in. Nowadays, people just have abbreviated it to, oh, God. And it's just, well, that's not what it's about here. That's just, what's it about? Words are very powerful and creative. God created through the word. Words create atmospheres. Words create relationships. Words create marriages. When you get married, you say words. Words are very powerful and creative. If you want to become a British citizen or a citizen of any country, you fill in various forms and you apply to become a citizen, but they don't just send you back your passport or your citizenship papers. In order to become a British citizen, you have to go through a ceremony. And during this ceremony, you swear allegiance to the Queen, and then you become a British citizen. So words then are creative. You're creating a new identity through words. And when you get married, you say vows and you create a marriage. But also words can also be very damaging. So if I say God bless you, hopefully you'll feel good inside. It's always nice when people say God bless you. It makes you feel a little bit warm inside, feel a bit good. Nice to be blessed. But on the other hand, if someone curses you, it can really disturb your day. Yeah, you can really get upset and really hurt, and it can really affect your whole day when someone curses you. It can really ruin things. Yeah, so words are very powerful, either blessings or curses. So this basically is about don't misuse language. I'll talk about rectification names the next slide. Don't misuse language, don't curse, don't and be very careful about the words you use. So sacred words, because of the 4 sacred words about sexual love, they ended up becoming swear words. So the most holy and beautiful words, which are connected to sexuality and sexual love, have actually become debased, yeah, and corrupted and become swear words. And that's really painful and a real shame. But the main point of this commandment is about priestcraft. It's about misusing, taking God's name in vain is misusing God's name. So how do people do that? Well, a person in authority, like a priest, might say to somebody, if you don't do this, if you don't do what I tell you to do, then God will punish you. If you don't do what I tell you to do, you will go to hell. If you don't do what I tell you to do, I'll excommunicate you. Yeah, and that's what used to go on in the Middle Ages in Europe. From time to time, the Pope would excommunicate a king if the king, and indeed a whole country sometimes, was put under a ban if the king didn't do what he was told. Yeah, that's called mistaking God's name in vain. Using the name of God to enhance your own authority and to control people and manipulate people and to get them to do what you want them to do. And that is really wrong. That's why it's number 3 in the list. It's a really serious sin, taking God's name in vain. Yeah, and so that's why Jews they won't pronounce God's name. If you want to persuade somebody to do something, leave God out of it. Persuade them using reason and evidence, or by your personality or your character, or have a good argument. Don't bring God into it. Oh, this is God's point of view that you should do this. Oh, I have someone very close to me. She sometimes, when she disagrees with me, she says, are you really looking at this from God's point of view? Which means, are you looking at it from my point of view? That's an example of taking God's name in vain. And also using religion for political purposes. So again, religion is very, very powerful at mobilizing people. And so we can see often religions used for political purposes in the Crusades and also in jihad and all these different things, people using religion for political purposes. And again, that's a big sin. God hates it when people go around using his name to justify killing and slaughtering and imposing their will upon other people. And so in terms of rectification names, I thought I'd stick in a bit of Confucianism here. And so this is a long time ago, 2,500 years ago. Zilu, who is a government official, comes to Confucius and says, the ruler of Wei has been waiting for you in order with you to administer the government. What will you consider the first thing to be done? The master, as Confucius replied, it is necessary to rectify names. So, indeed, said Zilu, you're wide of the mark. In other words, you're a bit thick or stupid. You don't really understand what needs to be done. Why must there be such a rectification? And Confucius replied, if names are not correct, language is not in accordance with the truth of things. Yeah. That's really important, that language should be in accordance with the truth of things. It should actually correspond to reality. Really important. If language is not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried on with success. In other words, we want to do something, but we're not doing it based upon the truth of things, which means it's going to be a failure. Things are going to go wrong. That's why it's so important to have an accurate and correct understanding of the nature of reality so you can make good decisions. This is affecting the whole world now, this whole thing with the responses to the coronavirus. It's not the virus that's the problem. It's the way that governments have responded to this reality. When affairs cannot be carried on to success, art and music do not flourish. All the cinemas and the theatres are closed. When art and music do not flourish, punishments will not be properly awarded. When punishments are not properly awarded, the people do not know how to move hand or foot. There's just injustice. You don't know what to do because punishments are carried out arbitrarily. Therefore, Confucius says, a superior man considers it necessary that the names he uses may be spoken appropriately, and also that what he speaks may be carried out appropriately. What superior man requires is just that in his words there be nothing incorrect. So he said the rectification of names, he said, let the king behave like a king. He's got a job, he's got a role, he's got a name that goes with the role. It's a king. So he should conduct himself as a king and not get involved in corrupt practices and all kinds of personal things. Yeah. Let a father be a father. Let a wife be a wife. People need to fulfill the roles, and in that way. Very important. Oh, there's a confusion. Okay, fourth one, you shall observe the Sabbath. So what's that about? So the Sabbath is the most holy day. The nice thing about it is it comes around once a week. The Hebrew Bible, it's on a Saturday. It starts Friday night when the sun goes down, and it goes around till the sun goes down the following day. The nice thing about this is you're awake when the new day starts, not midnight in the middle of the night. So you can welcome in the new day, and you can also say goodbye to the day as well. Welcome in the next day. So the Sabbath then is a time for God and the family. So what does God want to do? God wants to create a God-centered family. So in order to have a God-centered family, it means you need to have a family, and you need to have God present there. So to have a family means all the members of family need to be in the same place at the same time on a regular basis. So that's why this idea here is a Sabbath is a time for God and the family, when the family nobody goes to work, because there's more to life than work. One day of the week, the family's together, you play together, you pray together, you read together, you sing together, you have fun together, you play music together, you play games together. It's just a day to invite God to dwell and live in the family, a time of great joy, a time of great happiness, and just doing that. Yeah? And every week, once a week for the whole day, they're actually creating a God-centered family. And that means there's more to life than work. So sometimes people go and they work 7 days a week. They're too busy to go home, and have dinner with their family, too busy to go home, read bedtime stories to their children, too busy doing this, too busy going to meetings. Actually there's more to life than work. But also there's more to life than fun. So you should work 6 days. It's really important to work. Work is really important. Some people just want to have fun all the time. So here's the idea. When you're weary, spiritual refreshments we found with nature, friends, music, worship, and solitude. And of the 10 commandments, this was the first one God gave to the people of Israel when they left Egypt. So when they left Egypt, Moses said to them 2 things. As they were leaving, the sort of leaving speech, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your might, and with all your soul, strength. And you shall love and teach your children. 2 things, love God and teach your children. I'm not going to go into that today. So of the 10 commandments, the first one he gave was the Sabbath. When they were, complaining in a state of dependency, then God said, okay, it's going to be manna. You're going to collect the manna 6 days of the week. On the 6th day, you'll collect twice as much manna. So you're not going to go out and collect manna on the 7th day. On the 7th day, you're just going to eat the manna that you collected the day before. So God then, right from there, he's setting 7th day is time to rest, spend time with your family, spend time with God. Then when they left Egypt, God didn't say walk faster. He didn't say work harder. He didn't say have more meetings. He said the first commandment was observe the Sabbath. Take a rest, have a break. If you don't, what happens? You get burnt out. Yeah, when people work too hard, they get burnt out. In our own spiritual community, I think this is one of, a very sad thing. We never really established the Sabbath. We worked very hard. A lot of people got burnt out. We didn't invest enough in our family and our relationships there. But, this is what God said. Observe the Sabbath because it is holy to you. For 6 days, work is to be done because work is holy. Work is good. It's important to work to support yourself and your family and the community. Not to be in a state of dependency, expecting other people to work for you. But the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. The Israelites had observed the Sabbath celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant. It'll be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days God made the heavens and the earth. On the seventh day he abstained from work and he rested. So if you want to become like God, it means you need to work 6 days a week, and then like God, rest for 1 day of the week with your family. But then you think, okay, this is for the Jewish people. They're the Israelites. But are they the Israelites or the only Israelites? So in our understanding, our community, we say, yeah, the Jewish people, they're the first Israel. Christians self-identify themselves as the new Israel, or we would say the second Israel. We self-identify ourselves as the third, or is it the fourth Israel? So to whom is this commandment apply? For whom is this an everlasting commandment? It's an everlasting commandment for us as well. If we want to create a God-centered family, then God, right 3,500 years ago, set up the structures for creating a God-centered family, the Sabbath. And so Jews have a saying. They've been through tough times over the last 4,000 years, had the ups and the downs, and yeah. And they have a saying. They say the Jews kept the Sabbath, and the Sabbath kept the Jews. So because they kept the Sabbath, because they celebrated 1 day of the week, every week, with God, with their family, with their relatives, and they passed on the stories, they had fun together, they enjoyed a lot of joy together, experienced love together, then this then was passed on from generation to generation and generation to generation. The stories, the traditions, the laws, the theology, everything was passed on, the songs, it was all passed on through the family from generation to generation. So that's why they're still there, because it's a living tradition, stretching back over the thousands of generations, a living tradition. So they say, Jews kept the Sabbath and the Sabbath kept the Jews. Okay, so that's an important tradition. Another one here, commandment. You shall honor your father and your mother. And when you say, oh, we've heard that before. But actually, this is really shocking. Yeah, it says that you shall honor your father and mother. So in the ancient world, this is really shocking. Yeah, and it's really shocking in many countries and cultures in the world today, because most cultures, especially in the ancient world, they were very patriarchal, a patriarchal family, where the man owned his wife and he owned his children. The man was the head of the family. But in this commandment then, it says you honor your father and your mother. So it means the father and mother then have equal authority within the family. And the father and mother need to work together, yeah, to be united with each other and support each other. So again, this is a very shocking challenge to the patriarchal family. We'll come back, which came about as a result of the fall, yeah, basically. The fallen family is a patriarchal family, but I'll come on to this, I guess, tomorrow or the day after. Also, it means lineage is important, yeah. We inherit wisdom from our parents and love, but also trauma, stuff. So we have to preserve the dignity of our parents. It's not easy to like our parents sometimes. We have to have the heart to forgive our parents and realize they're not perfect parents. They're just human beings like us. They have their flaws. They try their best. So we have to have the heart of compassion for our parents, to forgive our parents. And this is also about filial piety. So there are lots of different visions of filial piety. I'm not going to talk about that at this time at all, I think. There's Esau is regarded as having filial piety, Jonathan, Saul's son. These are, regarded as being models of filial piety. Okay, I've gone on far too long. I can go on forever. It's 12 minutes past 8. Simi, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, please join me in prayer, everyone.
Thank you.
Good evening, Heavenly Prayer and True Parents. We just received another lecture from Uncle William. Very thought-provoking, many questions raised. Many questions still being raised, but we're very grateful to be stimulated in this way, and I think it's very important that we're asking ourselves these questions now, so we thank you for that. And we want to offer this time now to you. On behalf of everyone here, I pray this in my name, so my daughter of blessed and true family, Arju.
Arju. Okay, thank you all, everybody. Have a nice day or nice evening, and if you're living in Russia, go to bed.